This episode was made possible by private internet access. Browse the web safely and anonymously while changing your IP address to almost any country on Earth. Get 2 months free and prices as low as $3 per month by following my exclusive link below.
When you use a public Wi-Fi hotspot, your data is completely unprotected. Hackers and identity thieves can grab anything. Embarrassing photos, your web history. Start browsing anonymously and only share what you want to share. I actually kind of like this photo. Private internet access. It's time to protect your online privacy.
On this episode of Meet My Inspiration, I talk with Laurie Woolever. Laurie is a writer and editor, and for nearly a decade worked as the personal assistant to the late author, TV host, and producer Anthony Bourdain. Laurie's latest book, Bourdain, The Definitive Oral Biography, is an unprecedented, behind-the-scenes view into the life of Anthony Bourdain from the people who knew him best. Welcome, everyone, to Meet My Inspiration. I'm Chris Minyen. My guest today is Laurie Woolever. Laurie, thanks so much for joining me today on Meet My Inspiration.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So let's start out with you sharing a bit about your background and how you actually got started working with Anthony Bourdain.
Sure. So I went to college and didn't study anything to do with cooking or writing, and moved to New York right away. Started working as a private cook for a family because I liked cooking and I wanted to be a writer, and I knew that I needed to make a living because I certainly wasn't going to do it as a writer, fresh out of college with nothing to say and no experience. So I gravitated toward cooking and food. I eventually went to culinary school, and then I was the assistant to Mario Batali for close to 4 years. He introduced me to Tony Bourdain when I was getting ready to leave the job with Mario. Tony was looking to hire somebody to help him out with editing and testing recipes for his first cookbook called Anthony Bourdain's Lay-All Cookbook. And I had done that kind of work for Mario, and Tony hired me pretty much sight unseen, just based on Mario's recommendation. And so that was my first time working with Tony. After that project wrapped, several years later, we sort of reconnected, and I became his assistant in 2009. And I kept that job until his death in 2018.
Right. So prior to working with him on that first cookbook, what did you know about him at that point?
I think I probably knew what most people knew about him, which was that he had written first a hilarious essay in the New Yorker magazine in April of 1999 called "Don't Eat Before Reading This," that sort of hinted at the some of the stories and some of the attitude that he then put on full display in his 2000 book, Kitchen Confidential. So I had read the New Yorker piece. I have such a vivid memory of reading it on the beach that summer, and some of the phrasing just was completely indelible to me. And then, of course, I read Kitchen Confidential like everyone else. And that was pretty much it. I hadn't seen him on television. I just knew that he was this unbelievably compelling writer that really kind of ripped the lid off an industry that hadn't been under the spotlight in that way before.
Yeah, and he did it in such an interesting way as well. So when you first started working with him on that first cookbook, what were your early impressions of him? You probably had an idea in your mind about who this person was, and then you started working with him. What were your impressions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I expected him to be incredibly abrasive and maybe a little snarky and just sort of larger than life, the way that he presented himself on the page. And in fact, he was incredibly gentle and very, very grateful for my help and for the help of his co-authors on the book. His co-chef at Lay-All and the owner of the restaurant were also co-authors on the book. So he had this right away expressed this tremendous gratitude for the work that everyone else was doing, and that he knew that that this was very much a group effort. And I was really surprised and pleased by how attentive he was to that idea that just because his name was the biggest on the book, he acknowledged that we all were working really hard on this thing. He also just seemed like he couldn't wait to get to the next thing. We had very few meetings in person with the Lay-All Cookbook, maybe 3 total. And they were very brief. He was somebody who always gave the impression that he was just on his way someplace else. And that, as soon as the business of the meeting was over, that he was ready to move on to the next thing.
So you have a new book coming out very soon. The title is Bourdain, the Definitive Oral Biography. How is the book different than a traditional biography?
So this book, in the oral biography form, takes the pieces of interviews from almost 100 people who knew Tony, and rather than kind of distill what they told me down into a single narrative voice, which would be my voice, it's just kind of allowed them to just tell their stories and left the language as intact as possible, while cleaning it up slightly for better readability. But it really is the verbatim recollections of people from his life, everyone from his mother, his now late mother, and Gladys Bourdain, and his brother Christopher Bourdain, his first wife, his second wife, his young daughter, and all kinds of people that he met from elementary school all the way through to the end of his life. So television colleagues, publishing colleagues, childhood friends, guys from the kitchen days, just a real range of characters and voices. So it doesn't read like a traditional biography that's been sort of meticulously detailed. There are a lot of details, but it really is Tony's story as told by the people who knew and loved him.
In your opinion, what do you get from that kind of storytelling that you might not get from a traditional biography?
Well, I just think there are all these wonderful details and funny little recollections that may not, if we're working in a traditional biography format, something like Tony being really obsessed with sun tanning, or the one time he did a stand-up set at the Comedy Cellar in New York. Just these details that to me really kind of shade out a life, but aren't necessarily the things that make it into a traditional biography, which is can be very concerned with exact dates and times and places and full names of everybody else. This really truly is Tony's story through told by the people who knew him. And it also, to me, it really reflects the way that he worked as a television storyteller, where he would go into a place, figure out who was there, ask them some really thoughtful questions, and then sit back and let them tell their stories without him sort of imposing his own view on it. You see it again and again on television. He's at a table with people that he's never met before in a part of the world that he's never been to before. And he doesn't want to be the guy coming in and telling them about their own place. He wants them to tell him what their stories are.
So the new book is a biography. However, there's already so much content about Tony's life, from his own book to the many hours of television he had done. So what more did you learn about Tony, and what will readers learn from the new book?
It's funny, working with him for so long and knowing him since 2002, I really thought I knew everything there was to know about this guy, because I had watched all the television shows, read all the books. I was in contact with him every day that I was his assistant, and I knew where he was and what he was doing and what was on the horizon. And, we had a very good friendly working relationship. And we wrote a book together in 2016. And so I felt like, well, I'm not going to learn anything new here. And that was absolutely not the case. I interviewed close to 100 people, and I learned something new about Tony from every single one of them. Those details, like the fact that he was a competitive tanner. He was the guys that he worked with in kitchens in the 1980s, and they would have tanning competitions in the summertime. They would go out to Long Beach during the day to kind of sleep off whatever substances they had ingested the night before. And Tony was, really insisted on being the guy with the deepest tan. So things like that he wouldn't necessarily, tell about himself. Also, some of the fits and starts that he had as a writer. I think there's this very romantic notion that he toiled away as a cook in obscurity and then just sat down and wrote this brilliant piece of nonfiction about the restaurant business. He was a very natural writer and a very fast writer, but he had been working for a very long time to develop himself as a writer and to develop the craft of writing. He had already written and published 2 novels, which of course I knew that, but I didn't know all of the ways in which he had really struggled for years to develop his voice and to really focus on becoming a better writer. So that was all. That's all in the book too. You know, the different people that he met along the way, publishers, and his friend Joel Rose, who has quite a bit to say about meeting Tony as a hungry young writer and how he kind of helped him to develop his voice. I don't think I realized, there was never a conversation I had with Tony, but I don't think I realized the extent to which he was quite ambivalent about being the television personality that he became. From the very beginning, he was not sold on the idea that he wanted to be on television. And there was, again, a lot of fits and starts and questioning and sort of self-doubt about taking that path. As much as he wanted it, he also felt conflicted. And I think that kind of was a through line throughout his entire television career. In a way, I think that's what made him such a compelling television presence, because he wasn't out there as a shiny showman. You know, there was always that little bit of self-deprecation and, you know, awareness and kind of breaking the fourth wall. Like, I know some of this is ridiculous, and, you know, I know that I know I'm lucky, and I know I'm also ridiculous. And I think he was really brilliant at kind of balancing those elements, the self-doubt and the you know, the incredible charisma that he had.
It doesn't seem like he would have done television. It doesn't seem to fit with his character. The product that they created eventually very much captured his personality and his viewpoint. But early on, he was just kind of going through the motions, don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah. And his producing partners, Chris and Lydia, go into that extensively in the book about how, you know, it was their idea. They had read Kitchen Confidential. They heard he was doing a second book. And they, as producers do, they were constantly sort of looking for the next story to tell. And they reached out to him and said, would you consider working with us? And he was pretty nonchalant about it. And also, I think they realized quickly, pretty conflicted, again, about, I think he understood what it meant to sort of make that leap into being a television personality. And in a way, it made him into somebody that he had always sort of despised. You know, I think as a anonymous cook toiling in obscurity, I think there's a little bit of an attitude toward people who are out there in the spotlight. So yeah, it wasn't, I don't think it ever fit very naturally into his character. And there was always, you'll hear a lot of his colleagues in television production saying that he was constantly trying to figure out ways to be on camera less. You know, his big line was more B, less me, meaning more B-roll, more beautiful scenery, more, you know, shots of other people, more of what we're here to see, and less of my face. So there was this conflict straight through from beginning to end with being on camera. You can see it, you know, and if people have seen the documentary that came out this summer, that touches on it as well. And the book goes a lot deeper into that, just those feelings of ambivalence and the kind of back and forth about, you know, all the wonderful things about getting to make television. You know, Tony was an absolute, just mad for films from a very young age, just watched movies voraciously. And it was, you know, one of his favorite things to watch and talk about films. He was obsessive. So the fact that, you know, late in his life, he got to, in some ways, be a filmmaker through the medium of television was a dream come true. And I think that's a hard thing to walk away from, just because, you know, one's ego sometimes demands that you know, take stock of how silly the whole enterprise is.
Did you ever talk to him about the first series was called A Cook's Tour? Is that correct?
That's right. Yes.
Okay, so I I actually went back and watched, I think the first episode. They were in Tokyo. It wasn't the Tony that we got to know in later years. It was a very it was similar, kind of had his voice a bit, but he definitely didn't seem comfortable. Did you ever talk to him about those early episodes? And did he consider like quitting in the middle of it, or just flying back home, or just saying, forget about this, this is ridiculous? What did he say about those early days?
You know, I never spoke with him specifically about Cook's tour and about all of that early ambivalence. And that was one of the things that sort of surprised me when I started this project of making this book. His producing partners, Chris and Lydia, were some of the first people I spoke to, and their story, which they share really brilliantly in the book about, you know, who and how Tony was in those early days, was surprising to me. But the thing that I did talk to him about, and that really stuck with me and surprised me, when he was alive, we were backstage before an appearance that he was doing to promote our cookbook, Appetites. This was in 2016. It was at the end of what had been a very successful book tour. He was appearing in theaters of 2,000 to 3,000 seats, completely sold out. You know, people paying extra money to be able to take a selfie with him. And, you know, it was just a really extraordinary success. And so this was the last one of those events. And there's just the two of us in the green room before he went on. And he said, "Oh God, this is such an what an embarrassment for me." I said, "What do you mean? This is, you've crushed it, you know, and everybody is really enjoying hearing what you have to say." And I'd been to a number of these events, so I had sort of seen his talk evolve, and, you know, it was like a stand-up comedy routine really for an hour. And he was like, every single one of these, I just feel like the biggest fucking fraud. I can't believe, it's embarrassing to me that people have spent money to come and hear me talk. It just feels like a fucking joke. And I guess that's, what do we call that? Imposter syndrome, right? And it wasn't entirely shocking to me that Tony had it, but that he had it to that extent and at that stage in his career. And after having, you know, had it been approved to him night after night that people really wanted to hear what he had to say and really wanted to spend their money to have the privilege to sit in the theater with him and buy his books, that was really interesting to me. That it was, you know, some of it was nerves, and again that he would have nerves at that stage in the game when he had been a professional public speaker for at least 10 years. So I think it really just speaks to the fact that although people see him on television and they see the charisma and they see the humor and the brilliance and the ability to speak in complete paragraphs, that there was also this insecurity and this sense of being an imposter and this sense of sort of not believing where he had ended up in life. And I think that you know makes for a much more interesting person. And you know, if you read the book, you'll see that there's just, if he was just a one-dimensional kind of, you know, America's next Marlboro man, you know, I don't think he would have been as enduring and compelling a figure as he was.
How was he with all of the attention that he would get from, you know, his audience, be it people who are reading his books or watching his shows? You know, he spent a lot of time in airports. I'm sure a lot of people were coming up to him in airports and asking for selfies. And how was he with that attention? Was it an embarrassment to him? Did he seek it out? Did he enjoy it?
I never saw him seeking it out. And if it was an embarrassment to him, he had the incredible good manners and graciousness to not treat it as such. You know, number of people in the book remark about his great manners and this interesting contrast between somebody who, you know, curses liberally and, you know, makes like fart jokes and, you know, calls Alice Waters Pol Pot and a moo-moo, and then, you know, has extraordinary, beautiful manners. I mean, he was raised by people for whom that was really important. So I think that really carried over into once he became a public figure. He was very aware that he was sort of serving at the pleasure of people who were his fans, you know, people who were spending their money to buy books and, you know, patronize the advertisers on television. And, you know, he understood that how the game was played and that he had gotten, in some ways, very lucky, or a series of lucky breaks to be where he was. And so I never, ever saw him be a dick to anyone in public. I think there were probably strategies to avoid being overexposed. I think that he wasn't out there looking to try and get recognized. And it really depended on where he was in terms of how people reacted to him. In New York, I think there's a combination of people who are going to play it cool because you never know when there's going to be a celebrity around. Same with LA. But then people will also, especially in New York, people also will, say hello on the street. But there's kind of an unspoken rule, I guess. And then there are other places where he wasn't really known at all, and he could sort of move kind of freely, different other parts of the world where his celebrity hadn't penetrated. And then there are places in the world where they really were crazy for him, like the Philippines in particular. He just has a very, very dedicated fan base. I was with him in Manila in 2017, and it was extraordinary to see just the different sort of codes of what's acceptable when it comes to approaching a celebrity that you really like. And that was the closest I saw after several days of really intense fan interactions and him being quite gracious and, for hours and hours of various activities. He did very slightly lose his patience with one person at the hotel who kind of just kept trying to get him to change his pose slightly. Like she wanted to have like a private photo shoot with him, and it was at the end of a very long couple of days. And I think he sort of gently grumbled something about it had been a long day. And, that was the only time I ever saw him even remotely not gracious toward people.
I read in Kitchen Confidential that his heroes when he was, I think around 20 years old, like he was just starting out at CIA. His heroes were Hunter Thompson, Iggy Pop, William S. Burroughs, Bruce Lee. And he said as a result of that, he wanted to kind of emulate them. And he said he was a real asshole when he was at college at Vassar. So he said for 2 years, everybody hated him. He was a dick. But in later life, he wasn't like that at all. But did he actually have a dark side? Did you ever see the dark side of him? And by that, I mean a temper or...
Yeah. I will say that absolutely. I mean, I think he was very good at understanding, reading people and reading kind of what would motivate them and what would demotivate them. So personally speaking, in my relationship with him, I don't think I was ever the recipient of an unkind, a sharp word, or
Wow.
I think he could read in me that I'm pretty sensitive, and that it was not gonna motivate me if he was mean to me. I also, I think I did a good job, and maybe I tried really hard to avoid disappointing him or making him angry. I mean, there were a few times where things didn't go the way he wanted them to, and he would let me know, but it was in sort of a gentle dad, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed kind of way, And still, I was like devastated, that I had disappointed him, but he wasn't, I didn't see that directed at me, but certainly, I mean, he was, and this gets discussed in the book as well by a couple of people. He was very well known for these sharply worded emails, to put it mildly, that were often hilarious and lacerating and, colorful language, but they would often be directed at a network executive or an editor whose work, the first pass on an episode he thought was absolutely off the mark, or a director or a producer, guys that were his longtime crew. And I think he knew that was a way to motivate them, that they could take it emotionally, and also that he felt so strongly about how the finished product of an episode was made that he had to express himself in the strongest possible language. Yeah, when he was mad at somebody or he didn't like somebody, I mean, like, look out, he wasn't a screamer. He wasn't to my knowledge, I could be wrong about that, but in my experience, he wasn't somebody who would yell and scream like a madman, but it was the quietly lacerating language that
I can imagine.
Yeah.
He was very good with words.
So yeah, Yeah, he wasn't Santa Claus, I mean, he retained that edge, throughout his life.
Well, let's get back to the book. So you interviewed about 100 people. So was there anybody that you wanted to talk to, or that was an important person in Tony's life, and you reached out to interview them for the book, and they just didn't want to do it because maybe it was too painful? Or did you get to speak to most of the people that you wanted to?
I was able to speak to the vast majority of people that I asked. There were a few people who were a little bit tangential in Tony's life, but were colleagues of one kind or another. A couple of authors who he really admired and who he had spent a little bit of time with, who declined because they felt that they weren't sure they knew him well enough to speak about him, and they didn't want to sort of be overstate the case of their friendship. There was one really brilliant cinematographer who I had very much hoped to speak with, and his story plays a big part in the later chapters in the book. His name is Zach Zamboni, and he was somebody that Tony was very close with, and he declined to speak to me, but his parts of his story do get told in the book in a pretty compelling way. And there was a documentary filmmaker named Dimitri Castorine, who actually started making a film about Tony about 20 years ago, right? Or more now, 21 years ago, right? When Kitchen Confidential came out, he got Tony to agree to be the subject of a documentary film. He never ended up cutting that into a film, but he's still alive, and there's all this wonderful footage, a lot of which you can see in the film Roadrunner. And for whatever reason, Dimitri didn't, he felt that everything he had to say about Tony was in that footage. So he very politely declined to speak to me.
Of course, in interviewing those 100 or so people, inevitably the topic of Tony's death would come up. And for you, that's a painful thing. For them, that's a painful thing. For people who love Tony, that's a painful thing. It must have been very difficult for you personally to be opening that wound again and again for each interview. Did you become kind of numb to it, or how was that for you?
Yeah, I that's a good way to put it. So this book came out of a discussion between myself and Tony's longtime editor, Daniel Halpern at Echo, and his agent, Kim Witherspoon, who's my agent. In the, very shortly, probably a month or less after Tony's death, we were talking about, whether and how to do something like this book. And at the same time, I had already been working on a book called World Travel that Tony and I were meant to co-author, that was published earlier this year. And so then in the aftermath of Tony's death, I had 2 books about and or with him that I had to finish. And I will say that continuing to be steeped in all things Tony for 3+ years after his death was both very painful, but also extraordinarily helpful in kind of working through the early parts of grief, and getting to having the privilege of being trusted to do these books, and having it be my job to go back and watch old episodes, read the books again, and start to talk to the people that knew him. It was painful, but I think it was a sort of an incremental process of coming to terms as best I could or can with Tony's death. I will say with this book, the oral biography, I found it much easier in some ways, because it was not as lonely a process, getting to spend time either in person or on the phone or on video with all of these people who knew and loved Tony in some way was very, very comforting. It was like a very long Shiva or a very long memorial service, that also served a larger purpose. Whereas with the travel book, which I think the product is a more lighthearted and sort of celebratory product, the process of that was incredibly lonely, because I was supposed to be co-authoring it with Tony. He was going to write a bunch of new essays, and it just, I knew what it was, how much fun it was to write a book with Tony, and then there I was without Tony, with the burden of creating a book. So two very different experiences, but I can't imagine Tony dying and then me having to that being it for my involvement with him and his work and his life. I'm very grateful to have had these few years to continue to work with him as much as one can.
So you have the new book, you have the other book, World Travel. Do you think this is your final Bourdain project? Are you moving on, or do you have ideas for something else?
Well, as far as an overt Bourdain project, yes, I think these two will be it. There's no question in my mind that everything I do will continue to be inspired in some way by him and by my experience of working with him as long as I did, and the travel that I got to do with him, and all of the influence he had on me as a writer and a thinker. So yeah, I don't think there'll be another Bourdain titled whatever, but he was really good at supporting the people around him. I think he felt very lucky to have had, again, this series of lucky breaks, which, the more talent and hard work you have, the luckier you seem to get. But I think he was really cognizant of trying to help other people around him. So as, knowing that I was a writer, he was just incredibly encouraging, and wherever he could find ways to give me opportunities to shine as a writer, he would do that. For instance, the cookbook that we wrote together, I did some line editing for when he had a book imprint at Echo. I did a lot of sort of just on the fly editing for him, or ghost writing if he had to, write something. I don't want to overstate the case that he was a brilliant writer that was very capable of doing all of his own writing. But, if he was stuck, he might send me something and we'd kind of pass it back and forth. So, again, I think that's something that'll be with me for the rest of my life. That influence, the knowledge that he believed in me, and that, were he still here, I have no doubt that he would be continuing to, find ways for us to collaborate.
So Tony famously was a pretty heavy drug user. I think during the 80s, and I don't know when he stopped most of that stuff. Arguably, he was an alcoholic, possibly right up until his death. It's a tough question to answer, but what do you think, what was the root of the pain with him? It's a really impossible question, maybe, but you might have some insight that others don't.
Yeah, I don't know. I hesitate to co-sign on calling him an alcoholic, although it's, maybe he was. I think what it is fair to say, and this is again addressed extensively in the book, is the very real possibility, or just the straight up truth, that he lived his life very much like an addict. Whether it was at times drinking a lot, whether it was narcotics, or whether it was things like jujitsu, which he was, he spent a couple of years being obsessed to the point of one might say addiction, a healthy addiction to jujitsu. That's how he approached kind of everything, work, his romantic relationships. It was either he was 1,000% in, or he did not give a shit about it at all. So and so the question being, where does that come from? I think, my understanding of what it is to be an addict, and what it is to act like an addict, is it's just a compulsion within you. It's just sort of how you're wired, right? But there is, there is always something, and I can't speak to what the pain or the hole in Tony's soul was, the thing that he was running from or trying to fill up. But I think it's, in some ways it's just the essential human condition of sometimes some people can find enough of whatever it is, whatever the input is, love, sex, attention, success, that they can fill that hole. And sometimes there's just not enough of any of it in the world to make you feel whole and complete. So I think one could argue that Tony was in that latter category. I think he would bristle at the idea of being a poster child for anything, addiction recovery, depression, suicide. I think, he was just following his heart, following his gut, making the best decisions that he felt that he could make in a moment, and trying to do his best by himself and by the people in his life. And he fucked up. I mean, he did. And I think he would, were he still here, he probably would be the first one to say it. He made some bad choices.
Yeah, sure. I want to know, so Tony started television with the Cook's Tour, and he went for, I don't know, 18 years maybe, something like 300 episodes of television. And while they definitely evolved, and he definitely had his stamp on those shows, and they were very inspiring, they were beautifully done. Did you ever talk to him about maybe he was kind of tired of doing that? He was just kind of repeating himself in a way. Did he get to a point where it kind of all felt a bit silly and he wanted to maybe move on to something else?
Yeah, it was very clear to me, and I know that there were some plans to try and again, move himself off camera a little bit. I think he loved getting to participate in making television, so I don't think he was looking to get away from it as much as to maybe be on the other side of the camera, or to start promoting other talent up front and being a producer or director. I mean, he was very good at those things. So yeah, I think there was a sense that this format was starting to run its course, at least for him. But I have also heard from other people, and it's mentioned in the book, that he had also, was getting ready to sign a contract for another couple of years. So there was, again, always this conflict of like, I'm ready to turn it in, but I'm not, and so you could say there was maybe an analogous addiction to making television and being on television, where he knew it was wearing him down, grinding him down. He was tired. He was feeling a little burnt out, but he couldn't quite let it go either. I think there's something to be said also for the idea of the burden of leadership, and he was acutely aware that it was because of him that dozens of people were making a very good living and were earning Emmy awards and Peabody awards and professional accolades and supporting families. And I think he took that very seriously. He knew that were he just to say, all right, I'm done, you guys, I'll catch you later, that would put a lot of people out of work. And I think maybe he almost took it too seriously, because the truth is everyone would have been fine. Everyone would have certainly maybe been a little disappointed, but the people that work for him are extraordinarily talented, and they have, in the aftermath of Tony's death, a lot of them have gone on to do great things and continued to make beautiful television and do great work. So it's a little bit of a frustrating idea, knowing that he stayed at something that was really kind of grinding him down, because he felt he didn't want to disappoint the people that had come along with him for so long on this journey.
Tony described himself as a lucky cook that likes to tell stories. At the core of his success is that he was an incredible writer and storyteller. Were there any other creative endeavors that he was developing or talked about wanting to do? I know about the book with you, World Travel. Was there anything else that he was talking about?
I know he had started to work and play around a little bit with the screenplay format, and also with the like staged stories that might be mounted on a stage. He was just really interested. I think it was always going to be storytelling and fiction in some way, but I think he was looking to kind of try some different platforms and some different genres. And I'm quite sure that were he here, he would have continued to write books. I think especially with the pandemic, had he been sort of suddenly not able to travel after traveling extensively for so long, in my mind's eye, I think, God, he would have probably written a couple novels in that COVID lockdown or something. So he was in no way moving away from creative endeavors, but I think he was starting to expand the idea of what he could do with his time and his talents.
So Tony became more and more isolated over the years with the success of his shows. He was spending less time with the crew, more time alone, more time in his private car, less time on the set. Was that his choice? And what kind of effect do you think that had on him?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of it being his choice. I think he, at some point, the novelty of being on a set might have worn off. He started to, get older, get tired, and sitting around for a couple of hours waiting for the crew to light a room, I think became sort of less compelling to him. So, and then I think also the crew probably benefited after a while from not having him around. If he was, especially if he was feeling impatient, knowing that he's sitting there glaring at you while you're trying to get your lights up and everything ready to go, it's not a happy feeling for anybody. So I think it was a mutual decision. If I can sort of extrapolate, I mean, I wasn't there, on set when the sort
Right.
of the changeover took place. By the time I had started joining for the occasional shoot, he was very much, the talent that would roll in to the lit room with the sidekick already seated and just start the conversation. So I think it was it was both the crew suggesting it and making it possible, and Tony going along with it. And there were times, when I was the trips that I went on, there were times where it was clear that he just wanted to go back to his room, or he just needed to be alone. And then there were plenty of times too where he was, he made it imperative that everyone was going to hang out and have a good time. There was we went to Sri Lanka in 2017. And for the second half of the trip, we were in the northern part of the country in Jaffna, and there was not much going on in town. I mean, it was a town that had been pretty heavily impacted by the civil war in that country, and they were just kind of coming back to life. But really, the hotel was the only game in town, and the KFC that was around the corner. So he decided that every night that we were at that hotel, we were going to all get together at the end of the shooting day up on the roof, and the weather was, balmy and beautiful. And we would get a couple of buckets of fried chicken and a couple of bottles of whiskey and, several hundred cigarettes, and just hang out and tell stories, shoot the shit. And he was happy, and he was, hanging out with his friends, telling stories, listening to stories, blowing off some steam. So he did, when he wanted to, even in the later years, he did find ways to connect with his crew and to feel some kind of, social warmth. But, he was very, very busy. I mean, extraordinarily busy. In addition to television, there were just so many other things always going on. He had a book imprint, like I said, and so he was editing other people's books. He was doing his own writing. There were interviews and just a million different things kind of percolating. So a lot of times he just needed the time to go back and handle the rest of his business, outside of the television realm.
On No Reservations, one of the standout episodes was a trip to Vietnam where he had a meal with President Obama. That's a pretty unique experience, I think. I'd imagine that you were involved in getting that organized to some degree. How did that happen? How did that come together?
Sure. So that was actually Parts Unknown. That was in 2016. I was not involved. That was definitely sort of several pay grades above me. It was something that came from the White House. It was a suggestion of the White House that they do a segment with Obama, and I think it was, my understanding was that it was over a year in the discussion and the preparation. And I think as these things go, when you're shooting television with a sitting president, you never really know up until the moment that it happens if it's actually going to happen. So I think once they understood that they could be in the same place at the same time, and a really special place like Vietnam, I think there were just months and months of meetings and intense secrecy. It happened, I think, in May or June of 2016. I was with Tony in Japan in March of 2016, and he told me about it. He said, well, don't tell anybody, but this is going to happen in spring. And I had, so every season I would pick one place to go with the crew, and Tony would pay my expenses. And it was just a really nice perk of the job. So while we were in Japan, Tony said, don't tell anybody, but it looks like we're going to shoot with Obama in Hanoi in this later at the end of the season. And I thought, God, I wish I'd known. I would have skipped this Japan trip and gone to Hanoi. but yeah, I'm not sure they even would have allowed it. I mean, there was the level of I'm sure you can imagine that the amount of sort of background checking and all of the security that had to happen in order for this very simple meal of buncha and beer to happen between these two guys was a lot of logistics. So, and if I'm recalling correctly, the crew themselves didn't know that this was happening until I think maybe that day. They knew they were shooting a meal scene, but I think that they weren't informed about who was going to be the sidekick, or they were given a decoy sidekick, and I think it was just a matter of keeping things incredibly secure. So the result was fantastic. I mean, you can just it's such a beautiful episode, and really incredibly memorable and poignant, to hear the things that they talk about, and I think Tony asks Obama something to the effect of like, are we going to be okay? Sort of like, just tell me it's going to be okay, Dad. And this was close to the end of Obama's presidency, and it was phenomenal. So, but yeah, I cannot take any credit for making that happen. I wish I could.
Fair enough. So let's see. In addition to your book, there's a new documentary that you mentioned earlier called Roadrunner. It's a great film. I've seen it a couple times actually. I know that you were involved in that. So what was your role with the documentary?
So I was a consulting producer on the documentary, which was great. I was really pleased to be able to help out with it. And what that involved mostly was just connecting the filmmakers to the people in Tony's life. In some cases, they were the same people that I was speaking with for the biography. In fact, I think everyone that appears in the film is also in the biography. So it was kind of, making the filmmakers comfortable with the people that I was suggesting, and then also convincing the people that I was suggesting that they really ought to speak with Morgan and his team, that they were trustworthy, and that they were going to do a good job telling Tony's story, and that that it was that it would be worth their time, and that it would help sort of cement Tony's legacy. So it was great. It was really really interesting to see how it all comes together. I was interviewed for the film, but I was really careful to not say anything that interesting, because I sort of didn't want to be. There were things that there were ideas and concepts that I wanted to be, that I hoped would be in the film, but I didn't want to be the one to say those things. And so
What do you mean?
Just observations about Tony's state of mind, especially toward the end of his life. I just felt that, and this was, the interview was 2 years ago. So I think maybe my thinking has evolved a little bit, since then, but I felt like all the conclusions that I've drawn, in part to make myself feel better about the circumstance of his death, they're conclusions that I've drawn based on extensive conversations with other people and my own therapy and my own, sort of analysis of the situation and trying to make sense of it. And I just didn't want to be, I don't know, it's sort of a vulnerable position to be the person that's indelibly on film making pronouncements about someone who, not only is a beloved public figure, but is no longer around, to confirm or deny.
I think what you're alluding to is the big question of why. Why did this man with so much success, and so many people that loved him around him, why did he kill himself? And you didn't want to be the person that even offered an answer.
Yeah, it's, in some ways I think these things are impossible to know, and all we can do to comfort ourselves is to put together all the information that we have and sort of search our own hearts and come up with some rationale. And it's never going to be okay. It's never going to feel like it was it's just never going to be okay. I don't know. I mean, suicide really just leaves behind so much hurt that I think you can only kind of try and work through or live with. But it's one of the worst endings to one of the best stories, in terms of somebody who did so much with his time here, and to have it end that way is just, just super shitty, just to not to put too fine a point on it, but it's, it's disappointing and sad and enraging and just a waste, but there's nothing that we can do to change it. So.
Yeah. Well, what did you think about Roadrunner?
I loved it. I was so pleased with the way it came out. I first saw it at home before the Tribeca Film Festival, and I was really grateful to be able to watch it privately because it's hugely emotional, and some of that footage I had seen before and some of it I hadn't, and there's something very bittersweet, intensely bittersweet about seeing Tony kind of come back to life in some ways, and to see him speaking and moving and saying things that I hadn't had the opportunity to see and hear before, especially the footage from Alsace, where he was when he died, and from Florence, where he was shortly before he died. I hadn't seen any of that footage. Those shows didn't get made. And so it was really very, very bittersweet, but I think it does as good a job as anyone could possibly do to try and tell that portion of Tony's story in a 2-hour, mass distributed format. I think there's plenty of stuff. There's plenty of stories still to be told. There's a million little details that didn't make it into the film. That I think there are more details in my book, but I'm sure there's all kinds of stories. People have come forward to me since the film came out and since the book was announced, saying, I knew Tony at CIA, or I was another classmate of his, or I met him, in this or that place. And I'm sure there are a lot more stories about this guy. He was everywhere, and he met so many people. But yeah, the film is phenomenal. I feel proud to be associated with it, and I think it's a really good companion piece to the book.
Oh, well, yeah, that's a point I want to make. Is a 2-hour movie, you can only tell so many stories, but your book is, I think it's about 300 pages long, and I've read a great portion of it, and you just get such a much more nuanced and deeper insight into his life that you couldn't get from a 2-hour documentary.
Right. It would have to be a series. It'd have to be like a 12-part series to really, go as deep with a film versus the book. So, I hope, yeah, me too. I've been saying again and again that, for as much as I felt I knew everything about Tony, I learned a lot by doing these interviews. So I think even someone who is very, cognizant of all of his work and, familiar with everything about him, I think there's still a lot to be learned about him, by reading this book. And if you don't know anything about Tony, then you're really going to learn a lot about him by reading this book.
Well, it's a great book, Laurie. Congratulations on that. This has been fascinating. It's been a real pleasure to discuss your work with Tony and your life as well. I really appreciate your memories and insights into the life of Anthony Bourdain. And thank you so much for joining me today on Meet My Inspiration.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
My thanks to Laurie for sharing her experiences and her insights into Anthony Bourdain's life and work. You can find Laurie on Twitter and Instagram, both at Laurie Woolever. Her new book is available from September 28th, and I highly recommend it to anyone that was a fan of Anthony Bourdain. For more information, visit lauriewoolever.com.